Hello, and welcome to the Architecture of Rural Living, the podcast all about what it takes to build a home in the countryside. I'm Rebecca Baxter, Managing Director at Studio 11 Architecture.
And I'm Chris Baxter, Creative Director. Together we run an architectural practice that specialises in rural homes.
And today we're going to talk about the brand new NPPF that landed on Monday the 17th of August. So Chris, what is the NPPF and how does it help homes in the countryside?
Okay, so before we start that, isn't it nice to be a bit cooler?
Definitely. We've still got the fan going, but my goodness, rain is massively underappreciated.
Yeah, and we still haven't had that much rain at all, have we?
No.
I think one of the lessons that we've learned over the last few weeks and months is that overheating is a big issue.
Absolutely.
And I think maybe that's something we should address in the podcast going forward.
Definitely. I think coming up we should do a podcast dedicated to overheating and how homes can be designed to combat that moving forward. We have touched on it in the past in our sustainability one, but a really sort of deep dive into that I think would be very beneficial.
Yeah, definitely. So back to the NPPF. So NPPF, National Planning Policy Framework, and that has been around since 2012. So that's the first incarnation of that. And in essence, the National Planning Policy Framework is the document to which local plans are produced to, and it's the government steer on how they intend local government to interpret planning policy and deliver development, whether that's housing, commercial shops, those sorts of things.
Yeah, it gives guidelines on what should be allowed and what shouldn't be allowed,
Yeah,
and where there's circumstances where things could be allowed, what development should look like in terms of, I mean, there's been incarnations where I think beautiful has been in there when it comes to housing, which,
yeah. So it's interesting.
how do you interpret that?
It's interesting that you say it's guidelines, and I think I would agree. Prior to this version, I think I would agree that that's exactly the approach that was taken. So the first NPPF was 2012. Then we had multiple incarnations after that. So off the top of my head, 2021, 2024, differing versions, all relating to paragraph numbers. And we've talked about paragraph 84 houses. Well, that the phrase paragraph 84 directly comes from the National Planning Policy Framework. It's the paragraph which governs that area.
Yeah, the 84th paragraph in a very long document.
Correct. Yeah, correct. That now actually is quite different. So the government have produced a document that is not guidance anymore. It's an absolute. This is how local authorities should deliver sustainable development. And they've done that in an approach whereby actually the hierarchy of planning changes. So in the previous incarnations of the NPPF, we had a document which sat up here, which was the government's document, and then we had local plans which sit below that document. And
like an umbrella.
And one fed into the other, and development plans were the starting point to decision making, and the NPPF was a material consideration of reasonable weight. Now the government has said, well, actually, no, what we actually want is we want to produce a NPPF which is more akin to the development management policies that you'd see in a local plan. Mm-hmm. So they're being very, very prescriptive about how they want this to be interpreted.
It's quite definitive, isn't
it? There are levels of it that are quite definitive, yeah. And in essence, what we're going to see now is we're going to see local plans that are produced that are much more lightweight. So instead of having the big, thick documents that we have, we're going to see much lighter local plans that have more reference to localized literal plans of allocations and spatial strategies and urban extensions and those sorts of things, because they will effectively be piggybacking off the main government NPPF, because the development management policies are defined in the NPPF. You don't need to have that repetition.
No, very true. I think we should be clear and say that this all comes from the government's aim to build as many houses as they want to. We've seen lots of things change in terms of planning committees aren't necessarily a thing anymore. That's become a lot more difficult to get a project or a planning application put forward to committee, because essentially they don't want the grey. They don't want people refusing houses because they don't want to see them there. This is more about a tick box exercise where actually, what's wrong with building a house there? Tell me what's wrong with it. Otherwise, there's a presumption in favour, essentially. Is how I read. If you're going to make it very, very basic, that's kind of where we are now.
So it's a very positive document, and the positivity runs throughout it. So you're quite right. So there's a what we call a presumption in favour, and the presumption in favour came from previous iterations of the NPPF. People talk about paragraph 11D, the tilted balance when you don't have 5-year land supply and those sorts of things. All of the previous NPPFs had a presumption in favour for sustainable development. But sustainable development was only defined by specific elements. It wasn't defined as an exact. So it's a planning judgment element of that.
Going back to that balance that we like to talk about.
Balance, yeah. The tilted balance happens when actually, in literal terms, because the need for certain types of development, i.e. housing, if you don't have a 5-year land supply, is so high, the balance goes in your favour.
Yeah, so that balance is already tilted, literally.
Yeah. So the government have decided that actually, no, we want the tilted to boost the housing supply. We are not seeing the levels of housing that are required and that they aspire to. They have decided that tilted balance should be enacted on multiple types of development immediately. Mm-hmm. So you do not need to then demonstrate.
No, because it was always on the applicant to prove that was the case.
Yeah.
Especially when it came to 5-year land supply, most councils will claim they have a 5-year land supply. And to clarify what a 5-year land supply is, it's essentially the council. We've spoken about sort of calls for sites and stuff in the past, and it's those sites that will deliver the housing target they need within a 5-year period, and the council have to prove that that's the case. They have enough land allocated, they have enough planning permissions that these people are building these houses at the moment. There's going to be this amount delivered within a 5-year period. Sometimes that's not always the most accurate document, and that's where when you go to appeal, you can sometimes challenge that 5-year land supply and apply that tilted balance. But that's not necessarily the case anymore. It's not on you to prove that anymore. And the council actually have to do a lot more to prove they are delivering enough houses. They've brought in the housing delivery target on top of the 5-year land supply. And that document was released the same day as the NPPF.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. So, in essence, all development has a presumption in favour of approval. In really simplistic terms,
yeah.
Full stop. So then the new document then hones in on lots of different things, and the thought process is, if you're within a settlement, there should be a presumption in favour of approval for everything.
And let's be clear there, you've lost the word boundary.
Yes, so the NPPF does not talk about development boundaries. It talks about settlements, and it very clearly defines what a settlement is. But that does not reference a red line on a local plan of a settlement. It references the settlement. They're two different things.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Very positive.
Very positive, yeah. It then also says, which is different to previous incarnations allowed most local authorities to say, beyond a red line on a plan, you shall not have development unless it meets the following criteria. And the following criteria was usually agricultural, forestry, demonstrating a need for that to be in what's termed as the countryside.
Which was always really difficult. How do you demonstrate a need for something to be in a countryside location, apart from those agricultural buildings and dwellings for farm workers? It was always very difficult. You couldn't just say, I've got the land I want to build here. Well, that doesn't prove a need. In some ways it kind of does. But in terms of planning, that's not strict enough.
It was highly restrictive.
Mm-hmm.
It was highly restrictive. And obviously we worked in the grey areas of those policies, and we proved why you can produce sustainable, good development in the countryside.
Mm-hmm.
The new NPPF immediately recognises that. There is a policy within there, S5, which gives you specific criteria for when you can agree to development outside of settlement boundaries. And again, there's a presumption in favour of approving those items. It doesn't become a planning balancing exercise of whether the positives outweigh the negatives. There's already a tilted balance in your favour of a presumption in favour of those types of development.
It strikes me it's a lot more sort of, when you look at planning and development in Europe, it's more of a tick box exercise. There's more sort of gridded systems and things like that in some countries. But that tick box exercise, where it's not grey, you're not having to argue a case. If you've got it, it's yours. It seems a lot more prescriptive.
It's a lot more prescriptive. It doesn't go quite as far as the Boris Johnson government looked at a system very similar to the one that you're describing, which you see in the US and Europe and things like that. They did a big consultation on it, and then that never came to fruition. It's not as prescriptive as that.
No, but there's elements.
But there are elements in it, and the idea is a clear idea to remove a level of ambiguity from those situations. The government have been deliberate in that, and their wording in those policies is very deliberate as well. So they talk about sites being physically well related, not adjoining.
What is
two different
interesting
things.
is in the draft, it didn't say physically. It just said well related.
It did, yeah.
So they've snuck the word physically in there between the
I
consultation.
Think, but I read that as them refining their intent, them not changing the policy.
Okay.
That's the way I read it, because it's clear that it's not saying directly adjoining.
No, it doesn't say
boundary.
abutting. It doesn't say close to. It says physically well related, which is still grey. Nobody is completely clear on what that means yet, because this is so shiny and new. There haven't been any appeal decisions released on it yet, at the time we're recording this podcast anyway. They will come, I'm sure, thick and fast, and they'll become a much more clearer intent on what that means. But for now, that's a grey area that we feel could be quite interesting to work in. Yeah,
you're right. I mean, there's decisions being made now that do reference the new NPPF. When the new NPPF comes in, it's an immediate. There's no transitional document with it, so it immediately happens. So they must do that. But the reality is, none of these policies in the NPPF have been tested at all, either at appeal or the High Court. It's going to be an interesting few years, because there's still quite a lot of grey areas that you can anticipate people are going to try and test at appeal, to try and see how appeal inspectors see things, and see how the High Court sees things in terms of judgments. And we won't see that until some of the big developments happen, because it's normally big developments that create those kind of precedents, really.
Okay, brilliant. So apart from S5, which we've spoken about a little bit there, what else is there in there that helps homes in the countryside? Because it might not necessarily be that you want to build a brand new home in the countryside. It might be that the plot, if it's not physically well related, are there ways around that? What about previously developed land? Where does that lie now?
So all of those are really good, and all of those actually now again start to create this presumption in favour of approval,
which wasn't there
before. Yeah. So previously developed land can now be developed, and there is a specific reference in the NPPF to change of use to residential. There are no restrictions other than that. It also now recognises groups of houses outside settlements and infilling within groups of houses. Now, I've been going through the word infilling all week in my head,
We've been looking at
and looking at
definitions.
definitions and seeing how that could relate to certain sites and things like that. And again, this is one of the ones that is going to get tested at appeal, because what is infilling? I think I understand infilling in its basic terms, but I don't know
To what
to
extreme
what
can we
extreme.
infill?
Well, to what not to what extreme, but to what extent changes from infill to a development on its own. I don't know the answer to that. I don't know the answer to that yet, and I'm not sure I'm going to know the answer to that until somebody else decides that. So there are other mechanisms. There were also the retention of the obvious things. So paragraph 84 now becomes HO11, which is isolated houses in the countryside. My view is that there is some ambiguity between HO11 and policy S5 that we're going to have some arguments over around isolated and things like that.
Although Braintree still exists. So there is a definition out there for isolated under the Braintree ruling.
Yeah. But obviously the Braintree ruling was done based on a previous NPPF. So that'll be another fun one, I think. There are the paragraph 139 that, again, we've talked about in the past, completely disappears.
There's a reference to it.
But it doesn't. Exactly, you're right. It doesn't disappear. So the reference to paragraph 139 disappears, but actually now paragraph 139 becomes 2 or 3 different paragraphs within the design section of the new NPPF.
Which again has become so much more clear.
It's become much more clear and it's much bigger. And there's a clear emphasis on good design, good contextual design, because suddenly now the NPPF starts to, and it started to do this in the last incarnation with telling people who are interpreting 139 about significant weight. Well, actually now, in multiple paragraphs relating to design, relating to climate change, sustainability, the NPPF says substantial weight should be given to. That's massive. Substantial weight is the highest form of weighting in my scale, in our scale, and most people's scale, I would agree. I think you could caveat that with very substantial, but in my mind, substantial is significant.
Well, it's not significant. It's higher than significant.
It is higher than significant. You're absolutely right. Yeah. So I think that's very interesting, and it shows a clear intent by government to keep design as a priority, but reward good design as well.
Definitely.
So where a scheme is well designed, and it does have some flaws because that's the whole point of the planning balance, then actually it's weighing those up in the overall scheme of things with a view to trying to approve it, because you can see the clear intent here. The clear intent is, let's be approving more than we refuse by a considerable amount.
Definitely. There are bits in there that talk about the local planning authority having to engage with the applicant, and if there's ways of tweaking, I'm paraphrasing here, this isn't exactly what it says, but ways of tweaking the planning application, and you can work with them to make sure that this gets an approval, that should definitely be the case. They need to be able to demonstrate that as well. And things about consultees, where if consultees don't get back in time, if there's no harm, then we shouldn't be holding things up in order for them to respond. They're all really positive things to make this system churn a little bit quicker.
Yeah, so I think we've probably all heard the phrase that people like to use, which is removing the grit from the planning system. It's not a phrase I particularly like.
It is quite a gritty place, though.
Because you assume that grit means abrasion, and so something that's abrasive is a negative thing, and that's why I don't like it, really. But there are lots of little things, in my view, that could very easily be resolved that up until now the government have chosen not to do. However, they appear to have tried to do this in a positive way as part of the new NPPF. And you're quite right. We're currently, or have prior to the 17th of August, been in a position where local planning authorities don't really need to talk to you. They don't need to
work with you
work with you proactively. And historically, we had a mechanism for doing that, but they're not really being held to account over it, and they need to be really.
Didn't really stick,
because lots of officers will go, well, this doesn't meet the criteria that I want, so I will just refuse it, in the knowledge that you're going to make another plan application, they're going to earn another fee from that, and it's all fine. Well, that's not really how we should do things. Old school, really good planning officers will go, okay, I think we've got an approval here, but let's talk about this, this, and this. And the really, really smart ones, and this is going to sound really bad, but the really, really smart ones are going to sit there and go, okay, well, I want a little bit more than you're offering. So this is what I would like. You come to the table, and I call it the little game of dancing around a table whereby we come and meet in the middle. Traditionally, that's how planning had been done for 20 odd years prior to the last 5 to 10 years. And it's something that works very well because everybody comes out of that situation feeling like they've got a little slice of the pie and everybody's happy.
Everyone's a winner, yeah.
Everyone's a winner. I think we're going to see a lot more of that now, and I hope to see a lot more of that now because we're currently in a position where local authorities are saying to us, you didn't do a pre-app, and on that basis, we're not going to negotiate any of the design with you. Well, that's absolutely ludicrous.
Absolutely. But interestingly, in that same section of the NPPF, it talks about LPAs having regard to what was discussed in a pre-app. So again, historically, you could have one answer in a pre-app and have a completely different answer in your application because there was basically a disclaimer at the bottom that said none of this has to stick.
Yeah.
This little note in this paragraph could change that somewhat.
Well, my hope is that it probably gives us a position where actually we're seeking to do more pre-apps. Mm-hmm. I think, as my experience of pre-apps is that you can get some absolutely excellent ones, but 90% of the time they are just a regurgitation of policy that you already know, and they give you an answer that you kind of already know. Mm-hmm. We don't want that. We want to know actually what's the real nuances of the project. What can we talk about? What do you think is critical to getting it over the line?
Yeah, a negotiation.
Yeah. Too often now we did one on a self-build site near a Grade 1 listed church. Mm-hmm. And there'd been appeal decisions against it, and we did a whole different design, submitted that as a pre-app, and it was so obvious that the planning officer did not engage with the new design at all and just reiterated the response from the inspector at the time. Now, I think if you ask that inspector to look at that in the light of a new design and a new framework,
they're material considerations.
Yes, then they would sit there and go, okay, well, this is a different entity now, and my decision might well be different. But instead, the officer who reviewed the pre-app just lazily just reflected what they understood from that appeal decision, and that's not a good pre-app. It was a waste of our client's money, mm-hmm. and it means that we're either going to have to take a more risky view on an application or not, because ultimately, clients get scared of how much money they're going to have to invest in a plan application now, and I think that's probably something that we ought to talk about in a future podcast. Maybe is actually the technicalities of having to deal with different types of applications. And I think the planning system at the moment scares clients, scares landowners, when actually we should be doing the opposite. We're trying to create more dwellings, we're trying to create more development, we're trying to create economic benefit.
Yeah.
And it's been clear that the government are using the NPPF to create economic benefit, which is the right thing to do. It's fantastic.
Definitely. And what's interesting is with these negative pre-apps that we've had recently up until this new NPPF, we've not had any pre-apps with the new NPPF yet. But I think what it also does is it slightly damages the trust and relationship between the client, the agent, and the council.
It does, yeah.
Because that sort of, I know you don't like the phrase, but that grit and that abrasion is there from the word go.
Hmm.
We're saying, what do you think of this site? How could we aim to get an approval on here? That's how the agent approaches a
Yeah,
pre-app.
yeah, absolutely.
And in our experience, some councils, not all councils, we can't tar them all with the same brush here, but some councils will tend to want to use a pre-app to discourage you from
Yeah,
putting that site forward.
yeah.
And that's really negative, and that's not what it's about.
No.
So hopefully, fingers crossed, this new NPPF and the fact that they have to have regard for their pre-app, but also they have to work positively with us. They have to be able to prove that, which is something they've not had to do before. And they need to work towards an approval,
Yeah,
not against an approval.
yeah.
And
So,
definitely things that are good.
my hope is that reignites something that's always been there, because the planning system has, in my experience, I've been doing this for like nearly 30 years. It it has always been there. It's just the last sort of 10 years that it's disappeared, and we need to get that back, really.
Definitely. I think this government has been really proactive in boosting the housing. They've not reached their targets yet, absolutely not. But they are trying to remedy that with these steps that they're taking along the way. And Rome wasn't built in a day. Britain's not going to be built in a day.
Hmm.
And I think between the things that they've done on the consultees, which is really positive in terms of they don't actually, there's parts in there that says that all consultees aren't necessarily needed to be consulted.
I think there's elements in there that are really going to give some planning officers some confidence, because my view has always been that the planning officer is the decision maker.
Mm-hmm.
Other the consultations are there to help inform that, but ultimately they should be empowered to make those decisions themselves.
That has always been the case. It's just not necessarily felt like that for them.
Well, exactly, and I think, to be fair to them, I think they have to walk a very fine line between making a good decision and not putting themselves in a position where people who are consultees can make their life difficult, and equally political entities within the council can make their life difficult. So it's a really, to be fair to them, it's a really fine line to try and walk. And I'm hoping that the new NPPF has actually given them a little bit more management to say, look, this says it here. If we don't do this, then we're leaving ourselves open for criticism and appeals and costs and those sorts of things. And I think that's a really good positive thing for planning officers.
Yeah, I think it takes the pressure, the political pressure away from them a little bit. And the same is true of their delegated powers now, where they are able to make the decision without the committee. It's an awful lot harder for a committee to be able to call in an application, and that's not necessarily always been the case. Committees are able to pick and choose, were able to pick and choose what they wanted to bring to committee, and they had the overall power, and that's been taken away now.
Yeah, so from the end of October, then pretty much, I think, based on what I've seen, 95%, if not more, of applications should be decided by a professional planning officer.
Definitely. In the past, and to be fair, rightfully so, the public have had the ability to pressure their local councillors to take something to committee because they don't want to see those classic NIMBYs that don't want to see houses in their backyard. They don't want a brand new development in their area because they feel that it shouldn't be there. That power, that pressure has been taken away somewhat with this new NPPF and the new powers.
Yeah, I entirely agree with that. I think I've never really had a problem with planning committees. I think,
luckily, we've dealt with good planning committees in the past that have had a proactive. Not all committees are bad. Our ones have had quite a proactive view of development.
yeah,
They've always been quite well balanced in their decisions, I would say. But that's not necessarily the case. And up and down the country, speaking with other agents, there's been some terrible committees where there's been cheering and booing and all sorts of awful things.
Yeah, I think that sort of thing is just completely inappropriate and unprofessional. My view on it is I've never had an issue with committees. I think you're exactly right. We've always had pretty good planning committees in the areas that we've worked in. And it swings and roundabouts, to be honest. I take the view that sometimes it helps us, sometimes it doesn't. It is just one of those things.
Because in the past, councillors have put their recommendation forward to committee. So that could be a recommendation to refuse, that could be a recommendation to approve.
Yeah. So,
But that doesn't matter. The committee has had the final say.
yes, but I think what I would say is that
They
if
take
you're
it into
if you're
consideration.
going against an officer recommendation, then you've got to have some significantly good reasons to do that. If you don't, then you're really opening yourself up to a cost application at appeal.
You are. Luckily, when we've gone against an officer's recommendation, it's always been a positive outcome for our client. So a lot of our sort of homes in the countryside previous to this NPPF have been officer recommendation for refusal because it's outside of the settlement boundary. Simple.
Yeah.
It's gone to committee, we've put our case forward, and actually on balance the committee have said, what's the harm here? Approve it. It's sustainable, it's a zero carbon home, all of the things that we've spoken about in the past, those tiny little weights.
Yeah.
The committees we've worked with have seen that as a positive. That's not necessarily always the case amongst committees, especially sort of bigger housing developments and things like that are always a little bit trickier at committee. And I think that's where the government have seen the need to take those powers away, because it is generally the bigger sites where committees are very against them because of the pressure they get from.
So there are local authorities that have ludicrous 5-year land supplies at like less than 2 years, and they deliberately sit on them, and they claim, because they're normally around the greenbelt areas, they claim that they effectively have no land available to develop. Now, the last incarnation of the NPPF in 2024 allowed those councils to go to other local authorities and effectively negotiate to offset their housing.
Really?
It was possible to do that.
A bit like BNG, but not.
Yeah, so where they were joining, where you had adjoining local authorities, you could say, okay, well, we're so restricted on land here, you've got more land. Can we work together and offset so that we have between us, we have a 5-year land supply? That's how it kind of, in very simple terms, worked. The reality was that actually they just were happy to sit on not delivering housing and just chugging along. Well, none of that helps the nation, in essence.
No.
And it certainly doesn't help the people in the area, the kids in the area, the people that want to work there and buy their first home, because the thing that I can never get my head around is if you've had a family, brought your children up in the area, why would you ever want to restrict them being able to continue to live in the area?
Yeah, and I think especially we're obviously parents now, and I think when it comes to having children and keeping those generations moving, the cost of childcare, you definitely need a village around you, quite literally.
Yeah.
And when we're saying that we can't build homes for our children in the areas we live and they are essentially outpriced, there's got to be something done about that. That can't be the case.
Yeah.
And rural housing aside, this needs to be the case for the entirety of Britain. I know the NPPF only deals with England, but we need those houses, and that's what this government has recognised, and they're trying their best to do something about it. It's great to see.
Yeah. So the whole of that area of the new NPPF, I think, is a really positive, great thing. I think we're going to start to see that tiptoeing through in terms of how local authorities are going to respond to those things. I think the development outside countryside is really good. I think the inclusion of what were lots of the old policies in the rest of the NPPF is really good. I think they, if there's elements that they didn't need to tinker with, then why bother tinkering with them?
I think that's probably true of sort of conversions and things that we've spoken about in the past. None of that has been tinkered with too much, really, has it?
Only in as much as there's less restriction to doing it.
Yeah.
So lots of the local authorities would, kind of hone in and say, okay, we've got to demonstrate that the building's got some historic interest to be retained and this and that. None of that is in the new. It just says, conversion of redundant building is in principle acceptable. So that's really good. There are little tweaks to certain elements. There's some little tweaking to flood risk, and that's mainly to do with how we dealt with the PPG that came in the end of 2025 around sequential test and things like that. And then they've also introduced this thing called a connectivity test.
Yeah.
Excuse me. So I am not entirely sure how this is going to work. Yeah. Because on a first glance of using this connectivity test in a rural district, it does not score well.
No.
But the paragraphs relating to the connectivity test almost suggest that it's a starting point.
Yes, the bit afterwards says that you have to have regard for local knowledge and sort of evidence that there is more than is on this test.
Yeah, it kind of says, you have to look at the qualitative and the quantitative measures around connectivity.
That was difficult to say, I'm sure.
It was, yeah. It's difficult to say in appeal hearings every single time I say it. So the way I'm looking at it is that I think it's a starting point.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's mainly deliberately for use in relation to development near train stations.
Yeah.
Because this is the big thing that we've seen the government and Angela Rayner and the Prime Minister talking about, which is there's a presumption in favour of approval to all development within a certain distance from a train station. Mm-hmm. And I think the primary use for this is actually that it's not as a sustainability tool throughout the country. Mm-hmm. Because we all knew that local authorities were applying an urban mindset to sustainability and connectivity up until the introduction of paragraph 110, when paragraph 110 was really clear and said, no, you must consider rural areas in a different way to an urban area, which from our point of view, we wholly agree with.
Yeah.
I think that approach is still retained within the paragraphs, within the TR policies. And I think we've still got to evidence it, but we probably need to evidence it a little bit more than we have done in the past, for instance. So I think that's very interesting. And again, that will be something that will be tested at appeal going forward. I also think that we've touched on it earlier. Design has become a much bigger part of the NPPF. Mm-hmm. And they're very prescriptive. And now we've moved away from National Design Guide to looking at the 7 principles that are included within the NPPF, and I think the fact that they're very prescriptive about that and setting out how that you should demonstrate how you meet those principles is brilliant. It removes the ambiguity. It gives us as agents working for clients, okay, so this is what we've got to do. We do this as a process anyway, but we've got to actually evidence it, and I think that's great.
And what is interesting is in those 7 principles, it's not necessarily all about it looking pretty. It's about how it reacts to climate change. It's about how it's sustainable, how it's meeting that future home standard, all of those things as well, which is what we've banged on about for ages. Yes, houses should be aesthetically pleasing. Yes, they should be contextual. But behind that, there is a whole lot of good design which makes that house safe, livable, all of those things.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So we've always said it. Contextual design is the only way you should really design.
Yes.
But you're quite right. In the technical detail behind the outside aesthetic, that needs to be taken into account as well. And we do that naturally, but it's good that it starts to get recognised. And that then leads into the climate change element of the NPPF, whereby, again, it references substantial weight should be provided to, and it gives you very prescriptive elements. One of which is renewable energy, significant size renewable energy, design that improves existing structures, design that suggests that it's going beyond the norm, again, should have significant weight attributed to it.
Definitely. I think what we can take away from all of this is that every opportunity in the old NPPF is still there. It's just become bolstered, and lots of it has been given more weight, more positivity, and more of a chance.
Yeah, absolutely. There were a few bits that were going to get tested because it's a brand new document, and like I highlighted earlier, I think there's a little bit of conflict in the policies between S5 and HO11. But they'll refine that. They'll work those little things out, and they'll refine that, and then we'll find in another year's time or 2 years' time we'll have another incarnation with a little bit of just refined wording. But as an overall concept, I think it's really, really good. And I think there's going to be people out there that say, "Oh no, how dare you develop in the countryside?" Well, we need to, is the short answer.
And
And
also, I think lots of people with that mindset forget that every house was once an open field. Every house was once the countryside. The entirety of Britain was once just countryside.
yeah,
And those developments and those settlements have been built over time, and they naturally expand. It's not that we want grand houses that nobody else can achieve in places where we're going to destroy all of the natural wildlife. That's not what development in the countryside is. Development in the countryside is the natural expansion of settlements in order to accommodate our ever-growing society.
yeah. And I think people misunderstand what countryside is. They assume that the countryside is like this amazing thing that's, full of nature and this and that.
And it is, to an extent. We don't disagree.
There are sites that are like that. But the reality is, most countryside is very, very ordinary.
It is, and I think when the bit that they miss as well is that when this land is cultivated, when things happen to this land, inevitably that wildlife is damaged as much as it would be by construction.
Yeah, I mean, if you're looking at arable fields, then arable farming is a very human management process. And if you talk to any ecologist, they will say that that is almost worse than your garden, if not worse. Now, we know really good farms where they offset land and they have perimeters that are rewilded in essence, and all of that is absolutely fantastic.
And sustainable farming is an ever-growing industry, and it's wonderful to see.
But I also try to remind people now that we have a thing called biodiversity net gain now, which is required on all development over the size of 0.22 hectares. Now, the reality is the level of biodiversity gain on sites that could be relatively medium-sized housing schemes to comply with biodiversity net gain is massive compared to an arable field. Massive. So I think we have to just get a little bit of perspective, and we've got to. It's a balance act. It's a balance of our needs as human beings to have shelter, and that's a real need, and the needs of nature and how we manage those things.
And again, that's a real need.
It's a real need.
We're in our 5th heat wave of the year this year. Climate change is real. The need to take care of our earth is real.
Absolutely. But we can still do both.
We can. Absolutely. And I think in order to gain a house in the countryside you still need to tick those boxes. We're not saying this new NPPF allows free development in the countryside. It definitely does not. Again, it's that weighting balance, but those weights are clear. It's about bringing forward a sustainable development in terms of how sustainably that house runs and all of those things as well. So I think, in essence, this is a really positive document. It's taken into account sustainability, it's taken into account climate change on levels we've not seen before, and it's opened the door to development and housing so that this housing crisis can be a thing of the past. Really positive to see.
Yeah.
It's going to be really interesting to see how it plays out.
Yeah.
And I'm sure we'll talk about it more in future podcasts. But for now, I think we can conclude that this document is definitely a positive thing for homes in the countryside.
Yeah, definitely. And I think what's really nice to see is the rewarding of good design, the rewarding of dealing with climate change, the rewarding of approaching a scheme in a positive way is being used as the thing that tips the balance.
Brilliant. Well, let's wait to see how it works out for us all. Thank you again for listening to today's podcast. We'll see you next time on the Architecture of Rural Living.